So I have spent the past year interviewing scientists in the field of second language acquisition, that is to say, language learning, and naturally, I actually asked them about comprehensible input, namely, this idea that is pretty widespread now on YouTube that comprehensible input is king. This is really the main factor that's going to lead you to become fluent in a foreign language. Is this true? And a lot of them actually, when I asked them this question, they were a bit taken aback. They, responded, "Well, I mean, of course not," you know, and no serious scientist thinks that, kind of like that. And so I was surprised because I thought, this whole thing about comprehensible input that we see on YouTube, surely it must be kind of the same debate in the scientific community, but it does not seem to be a debate. A lot of them were pretty clear that this is not a debate. Comprehensible input is good, it's necessary, but it's far from being the only thing that matters. So in this video, which is titled "The Case Against Comprehensible Input," I've actually spent the past week researching this topic and putting together a case against comprehensible input. So if you're trying to learn a language with a comprehensible input heavy approach or comprehensible input only approach, you may want to watch this video. So Stephen Krashen's comprehensible input hypothesis has been one of the most influential, ideas in language learning for decades at this point. And I'm sure that you've heard of it. If you're watching this video, if it's that you're interested in it, it's just the idea that we acquire languages naturally just by, understanding messages without necessarily focusing on grammar or, explicit teaching, explicit instruction. So it sounds pretty appealing, and that's probably why it's pretty popular right now on YouTube. You just do a lot of listening, a lot of reading, and it needs to be comprehensible. And naturally, you're going to acquire the language. But the thing is, from my research, what I've spent the past week doing is research on this. It seems like there's also decades of research that has revealed serious problems with this hypothesis, with this theory. So today we're going to take a look at the substantial body of evidence that I have found that shows that comprehensible input alone is just not enough to learn a language. So there are multiple sort of angles that we're going to cover. And I'm going to put all the sources, all the resources I got for this video in the description, so you can refer to that. But essentially, I think 4 or 5 categories of arguments against comprehensible input that I want to present to you. So the first one is, I took a look at, let's say, the sort of fundamental theoretical problems with Stephen Krashen's framework of, comprehensible input. So that is to say, issues that make it scientifically questionable from the ground up. Now, the second aspect we're going to take a look at is how adult brains actually work and why trying to recreate childhood sort of language acquisition using comprehensible input doesn't really make sense for adult learners. Because I'm assuming that most of you watching this video, you're, adults trying to learn a foreign language. Third, we're going to take a look at alternative theories that provide better explanations for how we actually learn languages. Theories backed by, research that is probably stronger. And again, everything I'm about to say in this video is not just my opinion. It's the result of all the research I've done in all the scientific papers, which I'm going to put in the description of this video. And finally, we're also going to take a look at empirical studies that really show that, like, what are the results of comprehensible input alone or comprehensible input heavy approaches? What are the exact sort of results when you actually do that for many years? So by the end of this video, you're going to understand why the language learning field, at least, the researchers have moved away pretty much from comprehensible input as a complete solution and toward a more balanced, evidence-based approach. So let's dive in. So the first thing we need to, I'm going to present is the fundamental issues with comprehensible input. So, back in 1987, a researcher by the name of Lydia White from McGill University published a paper literally titled Against Comprehensible Input in the journal Applied Linguistics, which is one of the field's most respected journals, apparently. And White identified a critical problem that Krashen's theory still cannot solve, which is, how do learners actually stop making mistakes? And so think about it this way, right? So comprehensible input can help you add new words and new structures to the way that you use the language, but it cannot really explain how you abandon incorrect patterns that you've already sort of acquired, right? So you need some sort of mechanism to retreat from incorrect forms. And, the comprehensible, CI theory simply does not provide an explanation for this. But, there's an even bigger problem I found in the literature, which is that the comprehensible input hypothesis, or the whole theory around it, is essentially unfalsifiable, meaning that you can't really design an experiment to prove that it's wrong, right? And so a researcher by the name of Barry McLaughlin, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, because the name is just in like papers, but I don't know how to pronounce it. So correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. Barry McLaughlin from UC Santa Cruz pointed out in, again, 1987, in his critique, he said kind of like this, right? So Krashen's theory works like this. When students learn successfully, proponents of CI are going to say, see, that's because they got comprehensible input. But when students fail to learn, then they're just going to say, well, they probably didn't get enough comprehensible input, or it wasn't comprehensible enough. And so no matter what happens, the theory can always explain it away, which makes it, scientifically sort of not very good. So and there's also a famous sort of, acquisition versus learning distinction. If you watch the, Stephen Krashen's presentation, the old one that you can find on YouTube, acquisition versus learning distinction. This is really central to Krashen's theory. There's no reliable way to really tell the difference, in the sense that when someone speaks a second language, how can you determine whether they're using acquired knowledge or learned knowledge? You can't, which makes the entire theoretical foundation a little bit, shaky. All right, so now the second category of arguments against comprehensible input. Adults learn differently than children, right? So this is where things, I would say, get really interesting, because up until now it was more like, fundamental sort of arguments against comprehensible input, but now we're getting into more concrete stuff. So there's a massive study, I'm sure that'll, some people are aware of this. This massive study involved 669,000 participants, and they found that adults actually outperform children, at least in the initial stages of language learning. And this completely contradicts one of this aspect of the comprehensible input hypothesis, like a core assumption, which is that adults should learn like children through a natural acquisition process. So this study actually shows that while children have an advantage in terms of ultimate attainment, thanks to a critical period, which, according to this specific source, closes around age 17. It depends on who you talk with. I talked with Dr. Batya Laufer, and I think she said 12. Kind of depends, but you get the point here. So adults actually rely heavily on different cognitive mechanisms. So, as adults, we use what is called declarative memory systems and conscious processing a lot more than children who primarily use what is called procedural memory for language acquisition. So, what this means is that trying to recreate childhood language acquisition for adults, which is essentially what CI only approaches attempt, it's really fighting against how adult brains actually work. So, individual differences, research also reveals that there's another major problem with, the one size fits all CI approaches, which is that, working memory capacity, language aptitude, and cognitive style actually explains 30% to 70% of the variance in learning outcomes for adults. And yet, with CI theory, we completely ignore that. All these factors are thrown out the window, and we assume that this one approach of comprehensible input it just works for everyone. Whereas the research shows that this is not the case. All right. Now, the third category of arguments against comprehensible input heavy or only approaches is, there are alternative theories that, have a strong scientific sort of backing. So, the first one I want to talk about is, there's a researcher by the name of Meryl Swain from the University of Toronto, and she has an output hypothesis which provides compelling counter evidence against CI. So, Meryl Swain studied Canadian students in French immersion programs. They received thousands of hours of comprehensible French input. And the result of this is that they could understand French perfectly, but they couldn't speak it very well. So, this goes against the comprehensible input hypothesis. Even though these students had ideal conditions, that is to say, years of comprehensible input in meaningful contexts, they still remained severely limited in their production abilities. And so Swain identified three crucial functions that actually training your output, right? Writing and speaking, there are three crucial functions that this provides. Number one, it helps you notice gaps in your knowledge. And then it also, it tests hypotheses, uh, uh, like the hypothesis about how the language work, your own hypothesis. And you sort of engage in a meta-linguistic reflection, which is a term that they used here, which means, you think about sort of how, your use of the language at a higher level. Okay, so there are also other theories that go against CI. Michael Long from the University of Maryland, he has a what is called the interaction hypothesis, right? Which shows that input becomes comprehensible through negotiation and interaction, not just through simplified input or just comprehensible input alone. So Michael Long, which is he is a prominent second language acquisition researcher. He developed this theory based on extensive studies of how people actually communicate when they don't share the same language level. So, like a native speaker and a language learner, for example. So, in this interaction hypothesis, interaction means that there's a back and forth conversation that happens when speakers sort of need to work together to understand each other, right? So, think about what happens when a native speaker of a language that you're trying to learn talks to you. The person is going to naturally adjust their speech. You're going to ask for clarifications, repeat things, negotiate sort of meaning until both people understand. And so this process gives learners both positive feedback in the sense that, they get confirmation that they're understood. And they also get negative feedback in terms of, you get signals when you're not being clear. And so Michael Long's research demonstrates that this type of meaningful interaction, not just input, provides crucial learning opportunities that pure comprehensible input alone cannot deliver. And so students who engage in interactive tasks like this consistently outperform those who only got comprehensible input. And lastly, there's research from Dr. Bilvin Patton, who I interviewed on this channel, from Michigan State University on input processing, which reveals another sort of fundamental flaw with comprehensible input, which is that Bilvin Patton found that learners have systematic biases in how they process input. So they might, if you get input, you might focus on meaning, but you're completely ignoring grammatical form, right? So this means that just providing comprehensible input does not guarantee that learners will notice the linguistic features, grammar and so on that they need to acquire. So, the research evidence is kind of mixed when you take a look at empirical data. So this is I think the fourth category of arguments that we're going to take a look at. If you look at large scale studies comparing comprehensible input only approaches to other methods, the results are kind of disappointing for comprehensible input. So, for example, there is a major 2010 study that analyzed 41 different research projects and that found that explicit grammar instruction consistently outperformed comprehensible input approaches. There's another 2013 a paper which analysis that found that students who practiced producing the language retained what they learned much better than students who only received comprehensible input. So, these massive empirical studies show that comprehensible input is not the only thing that matters for sure. All right. So, in the last category of arguments against, comprehensible input and Stephen Krashen is that the scientific methodology for comprehensible input is sort of problematic. So, Stephen Krashen's support for comprehensible input theory and the hypothesis comes primarily from what is called observational data rather than controlled experiments. So, my understanding here is that the research lacks proper control groups where, the research on comprehensible input just selectively cites supporting evidence while just kind of ignoring contradictory findings. And so the hypothesis is formulated in such a way that makes it really hard to falsify. And so that's a fundamental requirement for scientific theories, right? You need to be able to falsify them. So when independent researchers attempt to replicate comprehensible input studies or analyze them more critically, they consistently find methodological problems and results that don't support the strong claims made by comprehensible input proponents. So, for example, here, there are different studies that I have found. For example, Kevin Gregg's 1984 analysis, who said that there are serious flaws in the comprehensible input hypothesis, including undefined terms, lack of empirical content, lack of falsifiability. Again, Barry McLaughlin in 1987, there a critique about comprehensible input. He said, there's a problem with observational data versus controlled experiments and selective citations. So, there you go. So, these are all the arguments I have found in the scientific literature against comprehensible input. And look, I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher, so I may have misunderstood some stuff. But look, it seems like the weight of the evidence is, that there's enough evidence to sort of make you think at least. So in terms of where the scientific community is today in regards to this issue, leading researcher in second language acquisition advocate more balanced approach. And this is pretty much what I got from interviewing, multiple dozens of researchers on my podcast here. So, for example, there's a book called, it's more like a textbook called How Languages Are Learned by Patsy Lightbrown and Nina Spada. It's a pretty authoritative textbook in this field. And they conclude in this textbook that effective language learning and teaching requires comprehensible input plus interaction plus focus on form plus explicit instruction, attention to individual differences, deliberate learning approaches for learning vocabulary, and so on. There's also, Rod Ellis, who is a prominent researcher in this field, that, his research shows that explicit grammar instruction can actually accelerate natural learning processes without interfering with acquisition, which directly contradicts Krashen's warnings about conscious learning. So the point here is, the punchline of this is that the current consensus in the field has moved toward more comprehensive approaches rather than approaches that just use comprehensible input only, or which are really heavy, which have a heavy bias for comprehensible input. So it's a broader framework rather than just using CI as the sole method of instruction. So look, again, I'm not saying that comprehensible input is bad, it's useless. No, input is absolutely necessary. Comprehensible input is absolutely necessary for language learning. You need to listen to the language, you need to read the language. I do a ton of listening, right? And input is great because you can just, put a headset on and do your listening while, I'm cleaning the house or while I'm, commuting. But that's probably not the full picture here. So anyway, so that was kind of a long video. I talked a lot here. Tell me what you think in the comments. And I'm going to put all the sources in the description box, and see you next time.